Ever seen a Game Boy like this and wonder what all these different little connections are for? Hi, welcome back to the shed. In this video I'm going to be demystifying what's known as Prosound on a Nintendo DMG Game Boy. So if you've ever seen a Game Boy that's got RCA sockets at the top or additional little sockets at the bottom, or if you've seen me wiring up extra little bits of wires inside a Game Boy to the headphone socket and wonder what the hell I'm doing, this video might help you out. Enjoy. Right, so I've got a range of some of my Game Boys here, all with different modifications, sometimes with replacement shells. Obviously this one's got a slightly different shaped shell, this one's got a different screen, they've all got different colours for the parts and the shells. Some have got like silicone buttons, one's even got wooden buttons that I made. So a whole load of different modifications with these, but what I'm talking about today is the sound mods. Now this one here hasn't got any obvious additional parts. There's just one socket here, which is like your traditional headphone socket. I have actually modified that to change it from being the headphone input to being this Prosound input. So this is what I'd call an internal Prosound, which means that there are no external parts added to the Game Boy in terms of accessing the sound from it, so it just works via what was the original headphone socket. Other ones though, like this one here, has got an additional 3.5mm stereo socket at the bottom, or what is it, 1/8 of an inch? Yeah, 1/8 of an inch socket at the bottom. And I've also got these RCA sockets, stereo RCA, at the top as well, so they act as like an alternative, so the headphone socket remains intact. This and this, they work as like a line out. Okay, now the reason for having these line out sockets, if I switch on, is generally for people who like to make music with their Nintendo Game Boy using software called LSDJ, Little Sound DJ. So what you do with that is you create your own sounds, you sequence them and you make them into music. So I can play a song on there that I've programmed and that will come out of the speaker. Okay, now the quality of the sound out of the speaker isn't great, so what you can do is you can plug into your headphone socket, connect up to a speaker and amplify the sound. However, inside the Game Boy is a headphone amplifier, and what that does is it makes the sound louder but also introduces quite a lot of background hiss. So if you're performing live or if you're trying to record the music that you've made, it brings that hiss with it that comes out as part of the sound. So what you want is a cleaner sound. So these Prosound mods wire up and bypass that headphone amp and connect up to these other sockets. Now there's a few downsides to doing those, which gives you a few options in terms of connecting up. I've got a cable here. I just want to show you something that happens. So if this is playing the song, the socket that's built in, the headphone socket, has like an audio cutout, so although that's coming out of the speaker, when I plug in it cuts out the sound, and then when I unplug the sound comes back out of the speaker. Now unfortunately with the audio mod where you've got this Prosound, when you plug in or pull out it works, it doesn't stop the sound from coming out. You get the good quality line out from here, however it doesn't interrupt the speaker. So I've got a few where I've introduced mods, like I've got these two switches on the side, so that one will cut out the speaker. So if I wanted to be using that Prosound and play here but I don't want the sound coming out of the speaker, then I've got the switch on the side where I can switch that off. So there are additional mods that you can do. This other switch, if you're curious, is for these light up buttons here, because I like doing cool things like that too. And then at the top here I've got that one wired up for these RCA cables, so they'll just plug in to the top like that. The advantage of the 3.5mm is those aux cables are really easily, readily available, so you can just grab them, plug them in and use it. The advantage for the RCA is it's a little more secure, particularly for live performances and things like that. You've got a much sturdier connection, so it's a bit more reliable, but it's just a matter of choice. It doesn't actually improve the quality of the sound at all, it's just whatever your preference is. So that's the basics of the connections that we can have. I'll go into more detail on some of the other options I've got here a little later on, but first of all a little bit of the theory about how this all actually works. So here I've got a typical unmodified Game Boy, so our only means of getting sound out of that at the moment would be from the headphone socket. We're going to open up and take a look inside. So you've got one ribbon connecting two motherboards inside. Most of the modification work will be done on the back half The front half is simply where the speaker's connected, so if you do any speaker cutouts, you'd need to wire up to those bits. But in terms of the back half, what we're concerned with is two main parts. You've got the headphone amplifier, which is this circuit board here and all the parts on it, and you've got your volume, what's called your volume pot. Pot is short for potentiometer, which is the component that's soldered up in there. You've got these different 5 points soldered up there, plus these two here just to stabilize it, but it's these five, this little row of 5 that we're concerned with in terms of taking the audio signal. Basically, some of those is where the audio signal comes in, and some is where it's sent back out to the headphone amp. So beforehand it's just direct, it's a steady signal, and then the other two are for when you're adjusting your volume and it changes the level of the sound, and again that's an option that you can wire up to. Down here we've got the headphone socket, so you've got the socket there and the rest of this with 4 wires coming off there to the main motherboard. We'll look at those later. Also, you've got these capacitors here, and one of the things about trying to fit these extra sockets in, I mean, if you look at this, it's all pretty busy inside, there's not a lot of room to fit things in, but the preferred spot for a lot of these standard Prosound mods, like this one here, is in this bottom left corner, because in the front shell there's a bit of space there. However, if you look at where they match up, you've got these capacitors in the way. So a common way of dealing with that is there's a little bit of space underneath here. So what you can do is, I've got a screwdriver handy. So if you've removed those 2 screws, you can lift that control board away, and these 2 capacitors can actually fold flat underneath. They'll actually fit in there like that. Then this will go back in place. It should fit flat. You can put the screws back in. And then you've got the space available here for that part to fit. The part itself looks like that. It's commonly referred to like as a barrel jack, and then you just have a little nut that comes off the top. This mounts from the inside, so what you do is you drill a hole into this corner and that feeds through from the inside. The nut goes on to hold it in place, and then that gets all wired up inside. So with that in place now, nothing here is going to get in the way of it, so it's worth moving those 2 capacitors, and that's what frees up the space for that socket. That's why it's the common choice really. The RCA sockets like this, they need to go in the top, so obviously there's some issues with that part getting in the way of the ribbon here, so it can cause a few problems, which is why it's not quite as common. Also, some people don't like the look of these poking out at the top, and this one's a bit more subtle at the bottom, so that's roughly it there. In terms of wiring, let's take a look at what we've got here. I'll do a little sketch. Alright, so let's try and explain this. This here, our volume dial, is referred to as our volume pot, short for potentiometer, which is the component that's used. You've got a number of connections on here that are referred to as pre-pot and post-pot. So pre-pot is the signal as it arrives at the potentiometer. Post-pot, after, is where the signal comes away from the potentiometer. So your big difference there is your pre-pot is not affected by that dial at all. That stays at a steady level. At the post-pot, the other connections are affected by the volume dial. So let's have a little bit of a closer look on the sketch that I've done here. So that's referring to this area here and this row of these 5 points there. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points, and when you get used to spotting those, it's easy to remember that the lefts are together in the middle. So from the top it's right, left, left, right, ground. So you've got 2 connections for your pre-pot, which is your right and then your left. Your post-pot, you've got 2 connections, left and right, and then you've got your ground. You can also use these 2 points here as ground connectors if you want, but really any common ground that you can find on that motherboard will work fine. So I just tend to use this one because it's easy, because it's next to the other ones there. So if I was wiring up one of these barrel jacks, and I wanted to be able to affect the volume with the volume dial on the Game Boy, then I would need to wire up my 3 different pins, the long one to the ground and the left and right connectors to my post pot connectors. So I would connect the left to the 3rd one down, the right to the 4th one down, and then the ground to the ground, so the bottom one there. So if I was wiring up standard, that's the most common one, your post pot 3.5mm or 1/8 inch jack that goes down in the bottom corner, and I'd have 3 wires going across from here, route them along to that point and just wire those up, and that would be job done. More common for the RCA is to get a direct line out. That would be connected to something like a mixer. You can control the volume with the mixer itself, so you don't need to do that on the volume dial here. Your other advantage is that we were talking earlier about the fact that you don't affect the speaker sound by connecting up to these things. So if you've got the pre-pot, you can control your volume from the Game Boy on your mixer, and you can just leave the volume all the way down on here, which will stop the sound from coming out of the speaker. So if you were wiring up from these and you wanted it to be a pre-pot connection, then they would go at the top on the front half, so they would get connected to this bit here, wired up here with your left and right wires and your ground wire routed across. I would usually sort of, I'd set them up side by side like that, have that one with the wires coming across to this point. I'd bring the wires around and loop them this way. I wouldn't get the wires soldered in that direction, because then when you fold over you'll end up with some creases. So I'd wire it up there, bring the wires around, loop them back on themselves, wire them all up and connect up. So if that was being done with the RCA, I've got these coloured, you can get them in any colour, but I tend to use right as red and white as left. So what I do on here, I've got 2 connectors. The main connector, these would go to your right and left connections on here. So if we were doing a pre-pot RCA connection, then the right hand socket, this one would be connected to the top one, the left hand socket would be connected to the next one down, and then these tabs here, I would wire them together so they would be common ground on those 2 sockets, and I would route a wire all the way to the ground there. So that's how I would wire those up. So these are what I might call my external Prosound mods. And you can have combinations of any different ones. So you could use the 3.5mm socket with a pre-pot or a post-pot. You could have the RCA sockets with a pre-pot or a post-pot. So you've got like 4 different combination options there. You can also use, now where have I got one? A larger socket, like a big 1/4 inch socket there. It does exactly the same thing, just a bigger one, like a guitar cable kind of would plug in there. Also good fun for live performances, a bit more robust like the RCA ones there, but finding room for that is a bit more tricky. So this has got all the mods really. This has got so many different mods on it. I've got the RCA at the top, I've got 3.5mm at the bottom, and I've got the big socket. 3 different options there that I could connect to. What I also did there was I fitted a switch. I managed to squeeze a switch in because this is one of the Kitch Bent shells. It's like a custom shell, so it doesn't round over here, so it leaves a little bit of room to get some extra parts there, and also it doesn't round over as much at the side, so I had room for this switch here. So what that switch does, I don't know if you can see, it's like a little slide switch. So when it's up, it's on pre-pot, when it's down, it's on post-pot. So what I've done inside there is I've got all 3 of those wired up, connect via the switch. So if it's up at the top, it'll work with the mixer, and if I flick it down, then I can control it with the volume. So that actually gives me 6 combinations on the one Game Boy. So that's a really good example for the different ways that you can do it. So I've got 3 different connections, but they all are wired up to the same parts of the motherboard, so that just gives me the choice of whichever cable I've got handy I can plug in and I can use. But this switch allows me to swap between pre and post pot. Now the switch itself on the inside has 2 rows of 3. Now they're independent, but they are connected up. So what I've got here is when the switch is that way, it connects, like say, these 2 points, and when it's flicked that way, it connects those 2 points. So if I think I've got like a left row and a right row, then what happens is that these points here connected to all of the outputs. So that's like my right out, and that middle one is like my left out. And I think I just wired it up to all the 3 separate inputs that I had on there. Now here what I've got is my pre and post pot. So when the switch is flicked up, then that's on pre-pot. So let's imagine that that's the top of my switch and that's the bottom. What I did was I connected my pre-pot to the top. So my left row here, that pin would connect to here. The right pin would connect to here. Down at the bottom with my left and right, the left pin connects here, the right pin connects here, and the ground is just connected to ground as normal. And that was just from all the separate connections. The switch itself is just to swap between the inputs. I hope that's not too complicated. But anyway, that's it in a nutshell. So you can switch between the two. Generally you don't need to. Generally all you need is like one connection. So like on this one here I just did one big jack and then a big cable can go in there, and then that works fine, because this one was modelled, I tried to do it like a kind of a Fender Strat style. So I got the natural wood on the buttons, I got like the reflective chrome bezel on there. I tried to get that kind of teal colour to the paintwork, and I thought that emulated like a guitar cable socket, so it kind of went with that surf guitar style on that mod. So you can go as involved as you like with these mods. On the external ones in particular, you can have any sort of different socket, you can find a position for it, you can add switches to enable or disable them. There's loads of stuff you can play around with, but you can do it simpler as well. So I'll look at the next option, which is an internal Prosound mod next. So I've looked at the option of adding on all these extra sockets and things. By the way, this one here you might see is a PS2 keyboard socket. So that one allows you to connect a computer keyboard to it, and you can use that like a little synthesizer keyboard to play music, but maybe that's one for another video. But you can add on all these different audio sockets and leave your original headphone socket intact. Or if you want a bit of a cleaner look, you can do what I've done with this one, which is known as an internal Prosound mod. Now there's a couple of different ways of doing this. I have my preferred method, but there's another one that seems to be more common. So I'll talk to you about both, but this is much neater. It takes away the headphone functionality. You can still use it with headphones, it's just a bit quieter. But you lose all of the hiss, so you can connect that to an external source and it'll come out with a really clean signal. When I'm doing that one, I will generally tend to use the post pot option. So on my row of 5 here, all I need to do is use the 3rd and 4th one down. So that's the left and the right. If you remember from the top, it starts with right and then the lefts are together. That's the easiest way to remember it. The lefts are bunched up in the middle, so it's right, left, left, right, ground. So here I've got left and right at the bottom part here, so that will be affected by the volume dial. I've routed my wires down to here and they are soldered up to this part at the bottom. So all you're doing here is where this was normally connected up, it would be via 2 wires like that. If I look at my, where's my red one gone? If you look on here, there are 4 wires routed up there. All I'm doing is cutting and removing those and replacing them by wiring up. So some people will go from these 2 points, route it down and basically connect on those 2 points there. I think it's left and right, if I'm not mistaken. I don't use that method, so I'm not so sure. Someone else can correct me in the comments. What I tend to like using is these big solid contacts here. So you are using, if you look at those as a 3, you've got your left, your right, and they'll connect to there. So that's quite an easy way to solder up, it's quite an easy way to do. Where it's beveled here, I tend to use, I've done it in one of my other videos I'm sure, but I tend to use a needle file and just scoop out a little bit here so those wires don't end up under pressure when the whole thing goes back together. So that's routed there. I've got tape moving it along here, and and I'll solder up to there. So that's what's called my internal Prosound. So time for another of my dodgy diagrams. What we've got here, where this is all wired up, all you need to do is where you've got your collection of 4 wires here, you cut and remove those. Just simply cut them here and down here. You don't need to mess about with the grey plastic bits. Just remove those all together and then solder up your left and right. Now you could do that on those 2 points like I mentioned before. You could do it as a pre-pot and just know that that's not going to be affected by the volume at all. If you do it that way and that's the only sound mod you've got, your volume dial's completely redundant. So I would always tend to do that on these two. You can always leave it on full volume all the time anyway, it won't make any difference. So I'll connect the left to here where you've got this connection of 3, the left to the one on the left, the right to the middle section. Nice, I tend to put fresh solder on those as well because they've got a great big blob of decades old solder on there. So I'll tend to remove the solder, put a fresh blob on those. When I'm soldering those points as well, I'll do that. Now I am planning on doing another video soon where I'm actually soldering up the mods, but this is mainly about the theory behind it, like just explaining what a Prosound mod actually is. So I hope it's been useful. Any questions, I'll try and address them in upcoming videos, so do let me know in the comments. So there you go, I hope that's demystified what Prosound is all about. It's not as complicated as it sounds. Prosound sounds like there's something really fancy going on there. Just a simple bit of redirecting, rewiring, and generally avoiding that headphone amplifier to reduce the hiss. But I hope it's been interesting. If you try it out, let me know and show me how you get on, okay? I've got another video coming up soon which involves quite a few audio mods, so I thought this video might be quite useful to give you a bit of background knowledge before I go diving in and soldering up all these wires to all these different audio outputs, and you might not know what the hell I'm doing. Also on previous ones where I've just quickly wired up the internal Prosound, I've generally had people asking, oh, what is it you're doing there? Do you have to do that? Why are you doing that? You don't have to do any of these mods. All you need is a cartridge to be able to play LSDJ, and you can make music on a stock Game Boy. All these modifications do is improve the sound output or improve the visibility on the screen, things like that. But all of those softwares will work. So whether you've got Nanoloop or whether you've got LSDJ, do a little bit of research elsewhere on YouTube for what they do. But they will work on a standard stock Game Boy. These modifications just improve the quality of the sound. So yeah, I hope you liked it. I'll see you next time. Subscribe if you want to see more like this, and yeah, bye.